Imagine waking up thousands of years ago. There are no supermarkets, no factories, no modern medicine, and definitely no bottles with labels telling you what is inside. But one day, ancient humans discovered something strange. A mixture of fruit, honey, rice, or grains had been left sitting for a while. It smelled different, it tasted different, and somehow, it had changed. This wasn't ordinary food anymore. It had naturally fermented. But here's the fascinating question. When did humans first realize that fermentation could create an intoxicating drink? Was it 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, or did humans discover it thousands of years before the first great civilizations? The answer goes much further back than most people imagine. And that discovery tells us something fascinating about our ancient ancestors. They weren't just surviving, they were experimenting, they were observing nature, and they were learning how ordinary ingredients could transform into something completely different. But how did this discovery actually happen? And what was the first alcoholic drink ever made? To understand that, we have to travel back thousands of years to a world before written history. Long before cities covered the earth, humans lived in small communities. They gathered fruits, they collected honey, they grew plants, and eventually, some communities began cultivating grains. But nature had a surprise waiting for them. When certain foods containing natural sugars are exposed to wild yeast, fermentation can begin. The process happens naturally. Yeast consumes sugar and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. Ancient humans obviously didn't understand yeast or chemistry. They didn't know what microorganisms were. They simply saw that something strange happened to certain foods over time. And eventually, people learned to repeat the process. One of the most important discoveries comes from Jiahu in ancient China. Archaeologists found evidence dating to around 7,000 BC of a fermented drink made from ingredients including rice, honey, and fruit. Think about that. This was thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt, thousands of years before the Roman Empire, and thousands of years before modern writing systems developed. The people of Jiahu were already producing a fermented beverage. But this probably wasn't the only place where fermentation was discovered. Different communities in different parts of the ancient world may have independently learned that fruits, grains, and other ingredients could ferment. And that leads to another fascinating question. What came first, beer or wine? The answer isn't completely simple, because the oldest surviving evidence doesn't necessarily tell us the exact moment humans first discovered alcohol. There could have been earlier fermented drinks that simply left no archaeological evidence behind, and fermentation itself may have been discovered accidentally. Perhaps fruit was left in a container. Perhaps honey and water were forgotten for a while. Perhaps a grain mixture naturally fermented. Nobody knows exactly what the first discovery looked like, but humans eventually realized they could reproduce it. And that changed ancient food culture forever. As humans began settling into larger communities, fermentation became much more important. One of the most famous examples comes from ancient Mesopotamia. Thousands of years ago, people living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers developed complex agricultural societies. Grain was extremely important to their daily life, and those grains could also be used to make fermented beverages. Evidence from ancient Mesopotamia shows that beer was deeply connected with everyday life and culture. The ancient Egyptians also produced beer and wine. Beer could be made from grains, while wine was associated especially with grapes and certain regions. But here's something important. Ancient alcoholic drinks were not necessarily identical to the drinks we know today. Their ingredients, production methods, strength, taste, and cleanliness could be very different. Some ancient fermented beverages were thick or cloudy. Others could contain herbs, fruits, honey, or other ingredients. And fermentation wasn't only about drinking for entertainment. In some ancient societies, fermented beverages had cultural, social, religious, and practical roles. They could appear during celebrations. They could be used in rituals. They could be connected with hospitality. And in some places, fermented beverages were incorporated into food and daily life. But alcohol also wasn't universally accepted in the same way everywhere. Different societies had different attitudes toward drinking. Some celebrated it, some regulated it, and some warned about its dangers. So the story isn't simply, ancient humans discovered alcohol and immediately started drinking it everywhere. The real story is much more complicated. Humans discovered fermentation, then different civilizations experimented with it. And over thousands of years, those experiments developed into different traditions. But there was still one major mystery. Why did humans keep making fermented drinks after discovering them? The answer may involve several factors. First, fermentation can change the properties of food and beverages. It can preserve certain ingredients for longer periods. It can create completely different flavors and textures. And fermented foods and drinks became part of traditional diets in many societies. But there was another important factor. Fermentation was useful knowledge. Once people learned that a certain combination of ingredients could ferment, they could reproduce it. That meant communities could develop specific techniques. They could choose particular grains. They could cultivate certain fruits. They could control containers and storage. And eventually, fermentation became a form of technology. Imagine how incredible that must have seemed to ancient people. You start with ordinary grain or fruit. You leave it under the right conditions. And later, it has completely different properties. They didn't know about microbes. They didn't know about chemical reactions. But through observation, generation after generation learned what worked. This is one of the fascinating things about ancient history. Humans didn't need modern laboratories to discover useful processes. They experimented with the world around them. They observed results. They remembered what worked. And they taught the next generation. But alcohol wasn't simply a mysterious ancient invention. It also became connected to the development of agriculture and civilization itself. When humans began growing crops on a large scale, they had more grains and fruits available, and that created more opportunities for fermentation. So the story of alcohol is also partly a story about agriculture, food, technology, and human civilization. And yet, there's still one final question. Can we ever know who actually made the first alcoholic drink? The honest answer is, we don't know. There was probably no single person who invented alcohol. No ancient inventor stood up and said, "Today, I will invent the world's first alcoholic drink." Fermentation is a natural process. It can happen without humans intentionally creating it. So the first fermented drink may have appeared accidentally. But at some point, humans noticed the change. They experimented, they learned, and eventually, they discovered how to produce fermented beverages intentionally. The oldest archaeological evidence we have shows that this knowledge goes back thousands of years before the Great Pyramids. From ancient China to Mesopotamia and Egypt, fermented beverages became part of different cultures. But the story goes even deeper. The discovery of fermentation shows something fundamental about humans. Our ancestors were curious. They watched nature. They experimented with food. They learned from mistakes. And they passed knowledge from one generation to the next. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't have chemistry textbooks. They didn't understand yeast. But they could observe one simple fact. Something changes when food is left under the right conditions. And from that observation came one of humanity's oldest forms of food technology. So when did humans start making alcohol? We can't give you the exact day. We can't name the first person. But archaeological evidence tells us that intentional fermented beverages existed at least around 9,000 years ago. And the discovery may be much older than the evidence we have found so far. The next time you hear about an ancient civilization, remember this. Their world didn't have modern laboratories, but humans were already conducting experiments. Their laboratory was nature. Their equipment was clay pots, plants, grains, fruit, honey, water, and time. And sometimes, those simple experiments changed human history. Because one of humanity's oldest discoveries wasn't made in a laboratory. It may have begun with something as simple as food, left to ferment,